But in spite of the death of legal segregation, we do have hardcore barriers of de facto segregation that are still with us. And the church must be active in that area, in that particular realm, in breaking down the barriers of segregation at every point.
Looking back from this ancient of times to 1965, those were days of a height of anxiety within the church, an uncertainty. Many of us were new to the parish ministry, and surrounding Martin Luther King's coming here was that sense of anxiety. We knew he was right. We knew what justice tended to point us toward, but how were we going to get there? And Malcolm Calhoun had the great insight to invite Martin Luther King to a conference here.
Montreat was, in some ways, an interesting mixture of conservative and forward-looking. And the local community was more conservative, but the boards and agencies that sponsored the conferences brought in creative and interesting people.
We heard that Martin Luther King Jr. was coming, and of course it was pretty evident. I mean, it sort of like wildfire, sort of like, forest fire. Word spread all over the place.
I was 11 years old in the summer of 1965. The first thing I thought about as I was there in that packed auditorium waiting for him to arrive was the utter event of his arrival. I left my pew where my parents were sitting. They saved me a space, and I went out to the side door there by the parking lot. Maybe a dozen sheriff's patrol cars, Buncombe County sheriffs, as I recall, screeching up one by one there at the side of the auditorium, and then out of one of them pops Martin Luther King Jr., and he is hustled into the auditorium by sheriff's deputies, and the sheer event of that arrival burned into my mind the sense that this was a very important man.
When I was walking across campus, Ben Lacey Rose, my homiletics professor of just 5 years before, saw me and said, "Hey, Jack, you going over to hear Martin Luther King?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, come on, we'll go together." And we sat there and listened to this man, eloquent, beautiful, speech just rolling out.
Keep in mind that I'm an 11-year-old, and I probably didn't pay the kind of attention to that sermon that I would have paid had I been an adult and had I been more deeply schooled in who he was and what he was about. But what struck me about that sermon was the vivid cascading alliteration that he employed, the fervor of his preaching style. It didn't sound like any Presbyterian sermon I had heard before, and I haven't heard many like that since. And there was a kind of crackling sense of expectation in the air. And I think there were people there who, for whom to be there was itself sort of a demonstrated act of courage. There were people there, I'm sure, who were there because they weren't going to miss this thing, whatever their point of view was about what Dr. King stood for. I kind of got the impression that whatever set of assumptions you walked into that auditorium with, you knew that this was an important moment, this was an important man, and you had to take seriously what he had to say.
But it was interesting, when he finished speaking, there was just a moment of dead silence. And it was sort of like people were taking it all in and couldn't decide whether they were going to applaud or not if they hadn't been supportive of King. And then applause broke out and he got a standing ovation. And I took that to be a very positive sign that his message had come across and that even people who had not been his supporters when they came in had been moved by this address.
And when it was over, we were walking across the green going over to the inn. Ben Lacey Rhodes turned to me and said, "Jack, that has to be one of the most impressive sermons I have ever heard in my life." And I think it was.
But there was this sense that we've got to hear what this man has to say. And I think there were some people who were converted that night. And I think in that sense, it was profoundly church. There was an important word delivered, and there was a response demanded. And I think there were a lot of people who left that auditorium that night who were not the same people as people who would come in. So.
Somewhere along the way, we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must always realize that the time is always right to do right.